Hello, my name is Erik Jagnandan, and welcome to my presentation of my VR Lab Homework 5. So the first deliverable for this lab was to implement the first-person controller and the wand. So the wand I implemented here in Blender. I used 3 cylinders, a handle, a connecting piece in the main body. I added a wood texture to that in normal map, and then I added this sphere to the end of it with this magical purple texture in normal map to get a magical wand look. So then I imported this to my Unity scene, in which I then placed it as the child of the player camera root. I implemented the main camera, player follow camera, and player capsule for the first-person controller, placed the wand as the child of the player camera root, which now creates this effect when we go into the game itself. And so the next deliverable, which we'll also see when we get into the game, is the passive and active wand effects. So I did those both through particle systems. And so I placed both of those particle systems as the child of the wand. Now for the passive particle system, which we'll see immediately once we get into the game, this was very simple, simply just placing it as the child, positioning it, and providing the texture, which you see here. So now we get into the game, we can see that there is the wand. We can move around as the first-person controller. And we can see the wand is emanating this passive effect here, which I made with this particle system, and this red and yellow texture I added to the sprites. You can see it a little better when we look up at the sky. But the active particle system was a little more complicated to implement. I had to implement it using a script, activate and deactivate, which can actually be seen on the right side of the screen here. It's simply when we press Z to activate it, the active particle system is turned on. You can see it there with the purple sprites, and we press X, it turns off. As you saw, the default is for it to be off when you start out. The next deliverable was the 2 spells. So I implemented a fire spell and an ice spell. So to do these, I created prefabs, which consisted at the high level of a sphere with a texture of either fiery or snowy. And then as its child, the particle system which surrounded it, which was either fiery or snowy. And I had the appropriate textures to do that. So then I then place this throw attack point empty game object as the child of the player camera root. That's where the spells are launched from. And then I have this this script throwing tutorial.cs, which we'll see in a moment, which handles launching the spells. So when I press tab, I launch a fire spell. We can see it exploded. And when I press Q, I launch a snow spell, and we see it exploded. So spells explode either when they hit the ground or when the player presses Q. Presses the left click. And I implemented this using the projectile.cs script, which we'll see in a moment as well. And in that script, we wait until we detect a collision or the player left clicks, in which case we instantiate the corresponding game object for the explosion, which is just a larger version of the particle system, which we can see already surrounds the snow and fire projectiles. And then we delete the projectile itself. You can also see this landscape here at the lower level while we're in the game. You can see the grasses that I implemented using a texture I found online. I found these trees on the Unity asset store using the realistic tree 9 asset. And I added this ground with the grassy texture, which I sculpted using the brushes to create this realistic ground. It doesn't include like repeating patterns, for example, by manipulating opacity, brush size, those types of parameters. I was able to get a sort of natural looking ground which doesn't have repeating patterns that make it look artificial. We can also hear in the game the final requirement for this lab deliverable was the stereoscopic sound, and I had MP3 files for bird sounds, which may or may not be audible on the recording, but will be audible in the game. I'm hearing now. When I place these at various points around the forest on these audio sources and set they're all identical, and I set all of them to the maximum 3D setting. So this 3D audio being played identically at various points around the forest creates the stereoscopic sound for the player. now we'll exit from the game, and we will now go back to look at those scripts which I mentioned. So here we have projectile. Once we finish loading here, we have projectile. We're seeing here in the editor. So we define our explosion effect, which for the prefab for fiery is the fiery explosion particle system, and for snowy it's the snowy particle system. Every update, if we do get the explode key, which I defined as mouse the left click, we instantiate the explosion effect, that's the particle system, and then we destroy the game object. We do the exact same thing if we do get a collision. We'll also see throwing tutorial, which is a little more complicated and handles the launching of the spells. Projectile really just handles the explosion. But we run our throwing method if we hit the throw key. And we also have this ready to throw parameter, which ensures that we don't spam too quickly. We check to make sure we're ready to throw based on whether we've reached the cooldown time. But when we hit the throw key, which for fiery is set to tab and for snowy is set to Q, we run the throw method in which we set up the rigid body, we instantiate the projectile, then we set the force to shoot it forward. We add that force to the rigid body, and then we run the reset method, which once the cooldown has elapsed, sets us as ready to throw again. So that's everything for my presentation of my VR Lab 5, which we've got the FBC with the wand, shooting spells, active and passive effects, the spells explode around this landscape, which we can see at a higher level as we zoom out here with the ambient stereoscopic sound, which I have implemented around the trees with the 3D audio. So here's my terrain, and that's everything from my VR Live 5. Thank you for your attention.